Outside, can you please call them? You are feeling refreshed after the tea break. Let's start with the last technical phase of the day. This session would comprise of 2 topics with 25 minutes assigned to each of them. You can submit your questions on slido.com and use the QR code that is displayed on the screen, or use the hashtag to submit your questions. We will also be doing the live question-answer round as well in this session. So you could raise your hands and we can circulate the mic. So to begin with, I would like to first invite the session chair, Mr. J.V. Prasad, Consulting Actuary, on the stage, please. Now I would like to invite and welcome our speakers for the session, Mr. Tim Andrews, leader of Actuarial team, Chubb Business Services India. And Mr. Frank Chang, the President-elect, the Casualty Actuarial Society, CAS, US. Thank you. Over to you, sir.
It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to the 6th concurrent session on general insurance. I have very esteemed speakers on the stage, and so there were originally supposed to be 3 topics. I'll briefly introduce the topic. The topics as well as the speaker. So Tim Andrews is the leader of Actuarial team, Chubb Business Service, and he's going to talk about the chain ladder. His topic is chain ladder is aging nicely, but where are the grandkids, right? So it's going to talk about the evolution of the chain ladder method. Frank Chang is the President-elect of Casualty Actuarial Society, CAS, US, and he's going to be talking about actuaries working outside of insurance companies. He has deceptively, shall I say, mundane description as President-elect of Casualty Actuarial Society. He is also, by the day, I think he's the head of analytics, if I might say that, for Uber. So that's something that I think will hold our attention. We were going to have a third person, Pratik Khaturia, talking about competition analysis in GA. Unfortunately, he's unwell, so he's not going to be with us, so we'll do with these 2 topics. Very briefly, I'd like to introduce our 2 guests. We can't find a better panel of speakers. Tim is the leader of Actuarial team, Chubb Business Services India. He leads a team of about 150 actuarial staff based in Bangalore. He's a fellow of Institute of Actuaries of Australia, qualified in 1987. I was in 6th standard then, so he has, I don't even come close. But there's an interesting reason why I say I was in 6th standard. It has something to do with his talk. His scope of activities, Chubb India Actuarial team spans P&C pricing, reserving, capital modeling, as well as life insurance. They work as a part of Chubb's broader actuarial units. Tim manages the Indian team, provides domain expertise, mentoring, and support to development of team's capability. Prior to Chubb, Tim was principal and chairman of Australia's largest general insurance actuarial consultancy firm, Finity Consulting, where he led natural hazard pricing team, appointed actuary for many insurers. He led the project for Institute of Actuaries of Australia to build actuarial climate index. He's worked in Sydney, London, and Hong Kong. And his interest, applaud him, is to pursue his interest in supporting the development of top actuarial talent in the country. So, we look forward to his talk. I have been warned by Frank not to introduce him effusively because I'll be stealing his thunder. Suffice to say, he's the President-elect of CAS, which I said is deceptively mundane. He's PhD, he's FCAS, he's CLMP. He's an American currently living in Oakland, California. What I'd like you to hold right now is the thought that he leads core actuarial services analytics at Uber with a team of actuaries and data scientists. And he would like to, talk about that a little bit more when he touches upon his subjects about actuaries in other area. Now, while I pass the mic on to them to discuss their topic, I'd like to touch briefly on my interest in both the chain ladder method as well as actuaries working in other areas. And the reason why I said I was in 6th standard in 1987 is maybe I was a slow child, but I learned division in 6th standard. Right? And the reason why I touch upon division along with multiplication, I learned addition in 5th standard, is because the chain ladder method is a model that only relies upon dividing adjacent numbers on a triangular shaped table. And most of us as young actuaries, and a lot of young actuaries here, and given the India's demographic dividend, I am supposed to be old. So most of us, when we become actuaries, we aspire to work with very sophisticated models, right? We slog our butts off to clear, again, I'm an old actuary, ST7 or CT8, fail those exams many times, and then we blame them on, the stochastic calculus and whatever is involved. And after I, cleared my exam, I started working with, I worked for a long time with ICICI Lombard. Parent company was Fairfax of Canada. And the senior actuaries there, would spend an enormous amount of time looking at what is, the correct name is basic chain ladder. They would look at link factors. And they would look at basically a listing of link factors, by year, across years, and they would spend half a day just looking at it. They would go around talking to, claim managers, asking them what's going on, but eventually they'd come back and look at the link factors. And I couldn't for my life understand why they were doing that, till, I got into the practice and worked for about 15 years in the same space. And I did some of my finest work using, and I hope I'm not taking anything away, Tim, from your talk, but just my experience. And just a couple of recent experience. So people are contemplating, whether the claims have really normalized after the COVID impact, right? And when I say COVID, it's not the frequency, but the delay in claims reporting. And if you go and talk to a claim manager in your company, he's just looking at volumes. So he says, it went down during COVID, but now I'm getting more than my fair share. I think it's all normalized, and he'll tell you these stories. But I was speaking with one of my friends, the appointed actuary of United India, sitting right in the last seat where, most of our appointed actuary types tend to do. We instinctively tend to hide from the limelight. He basically, just by looking at the link factor, he was saying he's figured out, whether the claims have, whether the restitution of claims has happened completely or not, just by looking at link factors, just 2 numbers. And, he spoke a lot about, this and that, but essentially, the maths that he used was 6th standard maths, division. So, brings me to the point, a few years back, I was talking to my uncle who was a professor in ISI, Indian Statistical Institute, not the one across the neighbor. I told him, what do you think about machine learning? And in those days, the modern techniques of machine learning hadn't come through, so it was basically neural networks. And many of you would know that, machine learning's progenitor is Frank Rosenblatt, who was a psychologist, Perceptron. He basically built a machine in 1960s that tried to mimic the working of a human brain. And today, with advancement in computing and principally matrix multiplication, we are able to build better and better. So he asked me, Uncle, what did you think about neural network? And he said, basically it mimics the working of a human mind, right? Neurons firing and all that. And I said, yes, broadly that's it. He said, what's wrong with yours? He said, why do you want a machine to do something your mind can do better? And as actuaries, I think that's the first principle that I'd like to, my opinion, but still I'd like to state it, is we don't probably spend enough time looking at raw numbers, basic, in basic tabular form, because they themselves tend to convey a lot more than what any model can. And at the end of the day, what do you do with the model? You build the most sophisticated model. You finally look at actual versus expected, right? And in the top exposures, if your model isn't giving the same number as your data, you don't like the model. Then why do you need a model if you're going to really follow the data, right? So these are a few thoughts just from the top of my mind. And I come from the Indian market, right, where you basically have 5 or 6 rating factors. And even if you used rating factors, your channel will tell you what price to charge. So in those constrained situations, there's a lot you can really do by just looking at the data. So that's the first part. which is obviously something that Tim is going to elaborate on. The second part is about actuaries working outside of insurance. Again, I take offense to the topic of actuaries working outside of insurance. My sincere belief is, and again, this is a GA conference, conference in the GA arena, are actuaries actually maxed out within their insurance companies? We had people talking about pricing crop insurance. We talked about reinsurance optimization. I really don't see a lot of this work being done by actuaries in the insurance companies in the first place, right? So the thought of actuaries leaving the actuarial domain to pursue other opportunities is, I think, a little premature, at least in the Indian context. I did, as an appointed actuary of ICICI Lombard, contemplate working for Uber, but that job involved me following turn-by-turn navigation, right? Not the job that Frank is doing. So I was pretty frustrated one day, and I really wanted to quit. But the basic, so the regulator recently brought out, revised appointed actuary guidelines or something where they implored, in my opinion, the insurance companies to hire one more actuary. So they said, general insurance company normally have one appointed actuary. We would request you to have one more qualified actuary working in your company. Now we are in a situation where the regulator has to actually issue a circular asking insurance companies to hire qualified actuaries. Then I think it is important for actuaries to consider job opportunities within their companies, explore the extent of work that can be done. And there, I think, engage more meaningfully with the management of the company and tell them what are the things, rather than make presentations here, actually do that kind of work pro bono. I mean, you're paid a salary. I would do pro bono, right? You guys would still get your salary. You could do this kind of work in your company and simply expand the scope of what kind of advice an actuary gives to his own management, right? It need not necessarily be driven by what the regulator says or what your board says in case of certain evolved organizations. But nevertheless, I mean, given that increasingly the demands on an appointed actuary are becoming unbearable, I suspect some of our audience would be really interested in what we can do outside of the actuarial space. And there, one of the compliments that was paid to me by a batchmate of mine for Management Institute, readily comes to our mind, which is another skill that we have, which we don't appreciate. He worked for a bank, a large bank, Standard Chartered in India. And he said he really admires the grasp that actuaries have, whether life or non-life, the grasp that actuaries have on the entire business. He says, I guess you guys don't understand the power that you have in your hand. He says, I work for Standard Chartered. He was the head of wholesale banking. He said, I don't even understand my P&L fully. Because some part of the P&L is a transfer from treasury, I don't know how they make their margins, and it's very complicated. The profit and loss account for a bank is incredibly complicated. The way they set their interest rates and all that is not very straightforward. But he says, here you're sitting, and you basically set the P&L of an insurance company, right? Which is with respect to loss ratios. But given that we are, the appointed actuaries certainly are on the board, they get to participate, and by virtue of participation, they get the perspective of almost everything that goes on in the company. I mean, you attend audit committee, you attend risk management committee, you attend policyholder protection committee, you attend the main board. I think almost everything that's going on in the company is discussed in front of you and passes by you. So the kind of perspective that we are used to is amazing, and we know how to process that information. So that brings me to another strength that we have, which is not just data science or whatever it is, but the fact that we naturally are able to piece a 360-degree view of a business. And that should certainly help us, explore opportunities outside of this. So with this, I'd pass it on to esteemed panel. I think Tim starts first. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks, JV. That's a very impressive introduction. And actually, in terms of the chain ladder stuff, you're spot on the money in terms of some of the things I'm going to talk about. I was so disappointed we didn't get that heavy nightclub music happening then. I was looking forward to talking about that. Okay. Before I start, I do need to say I've spent my whole career working in consulting. When I was a consultant, I was encouraged to share things, and now it's a bit harder being in an insurer. I'm actually encouraged not to share information, and I kind of get that. I mean, Chubb want to protect their IP, and they don't want me to embarrass them. So I'm going to do my best to do both those two things that hopefully still make this somewhat interesting for you. So I'm going to talk about the chain ladder method is ageing nicely, and how are the grandkids coming along. So first, just let me tell you about what I'm going to go through to help you understand that. I'm going to go through a bit of history because we do need to understand how old the chain ladder method is. So a bit of history will help with that. And then I'm going to move on to why it's lasted so long, why we really like using it. And then I'm going to start talking about the grandkids. And I think they are grandkids, and I'll get to why I think they're grandkids a bit later on. So a bit of history.
I forgot to make an announcement.
Oh, yeah.
In this session, we are going to be taking questions live, so you don't necessarily have to use Slido. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I forgot to say that.
So a bit of history. The Actuaries in general insurance started in the early 1900s, actually, with CAS. Frankie, I presume so this is the very first dinner of the Casualty Actuarial Society in 1914. I hope the diversity mix has improved a bit now, Frank. Do you still have dinners like that?
Occasionally.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of interesting it started there, and in fact it started back in those days. They were doing pricing work, mostly for workers' comp, as I understand it. So kind of actuaries in general insurance kind of started in North America doing pricing work. Reserving work came much later, which is kind of interesting. Whereas in the UK, in India, in Australia, where I qualified, actuaries kind of started out doing reserving work and have later on got involved in pricing, so other way around. I wasn't meant to go to that slide yet. I do want to tell you about this little thing. I don't know if you can see this. This is my HP 12C financial calculator, which I purchased in 1982. Has anyone else got one? Someone must have an HP 12C. Oh yes, I can see a few hands. Do tend to look like slightly older actuaries. In its day, this was the actuary's weapon of choice for actuarial work. Mine was called Clive. It actually came out in 1981. I got mine in 1982, and it was a fantastic calculator. It came out, just to give you some context. That was the year that IBM launched their first personal computer with RAM of 16K, so you get about 1 million times more RAM now, which is fairly impressive. So look, that was a long time ago. To give you some idea of how different things were back then, you still had on the left-hand side there, that's the little book you'd take to your bank. And if you deposited money or took money out, they'd kind of write an entry in and add some interest on and tell you your new balance and give you your book back. That was still around when the HP 12C came out. On the right-hand side there, we've got VisiCalc. Some of you may have used VisiCalc, the very first spreadsheet that existed, 264 rows. It kind of solved everything sequentially and caused all kinds of looping errors. So, long time ago, it's kind of extraordinary then in that context that the HP 12C, 42 years later, is still in the latest, and I looked at a few of them, in recent polls, it was kind of rated first or second of the financial calculators on the market. So pretty amazing that it is in that case 42 years later on, it's still one of the best calculators going around. By the way, with this little book on the left there, my very first job, I started in 1981, I worked in the mortgage department, and my job was to go through, we had a book like that for every customer that had a mortgage with us, and my job was to go through when a payment came in, and which came in as either as cash or as a cheque, and I'd have to write an entry in the little book to say the payment came in and deduct it, and calculate the new balance and then add some interest. And at the end of the month I did the valuation, which is I got all the past books out and I had to add up all the final balances, and that was the asset that went into the balance sheet. Things have changed. That's what it was like when that calculator came out. It incredible that it's still number 1 or 2. So the question I'm going to be asking you is, how old's the chain ladder, and does it still deserve to be amongst the top methods that we're looking at? That's essentially where I'm going to start this discussion. So how old is it? It's not easy to work out how old it is. There's not much information about the origin of the chain ladder. There was a paper in the Casualty Actuarial Society proceedings back in 1934 where a guy, Tarbell, wrote a ratio method. He got one diagonal of IBNR and divided it by the claims cost. So it was kind of an incomplete triangulation approach, but it was the first time anyone had kind of shown ratios. And then nothing happened for years after that until the two Rons, so Border and Ferguson. This wasn't their landmark paper, it was another paper. They kind of commented on a way of reserving it that was the chain ladder as we see it now. But that was in 1972, after his paper was in the 30s. So we don't know exactly when it started. It was definitely before the 70s, and it was probably sometime during the 60s that it started being used. One thing I find quite interesting is there's quite a bit of suggestion that it was actually invented by underwriters. Which, look, I'm not surprised by that. As JV said, the method is incredibly simple. So anyone could have really invented it, and it's just the fact that we've kept it going for so long. But there's a suggestion it was actually from underwriters. So I'm going to say it's somewhere in the 60s. Again, things were really different back then when it was out. The workplace used to look a bit like this. I was born in the early 60s, but so I didn't actually visit that office, but I did work in offices where there were no computers on desks, just typewriters. When there was gender mix, but there were very distinct roles that the men and women did. And you can imagine doing the reserve calculations in those days when this method was, more or less invented sometime around then. And one really key thing that I want you to bear in mind is you could only do a reserving based on aggregate data. So this idea of an aggregate triangle of data. There was no potential to build models by analysing the claims experience at an individual claim basis and building it up from there. All we could use was aggregate data. And funnily enough, what we're using now is aggregate data, although even though we've got much more access to different types of data. So I'll come to that. I was quite interesting, and I don't know if you can read it. This was a comment that again, Border and Ferguson said in commenting on the paper by Tarbell, and they said, if one were to survey today's IBNR computational techniques and then reread Mr. Tarbell's paper, one might conclude it must still be 1934. On the one hand, this is a great tribute to him, because he articulated some basic IBNR concept. On the other hand, it's also a serious indictment against the actuarial profession that those particular skills have not been sharpened in almost 40 years. So they were kind of saying then in 1972, not much has happened in the past 40 years. I'm sitting here in 2023 and thinking, well, not much has happened since 1972, really in terms of the methods we're using, which I think is quite extraordinary. Again, I'll come back to that. I won't chat to that slide because we all know. Look, the chain ladder method itself is incredibly simple. Let's not pretend anything else, even though sometimes it's presented in ways that make it seem more complex. It's really curve fitting based on a bunch of leak ratios, so there's nothing to it really. So the question, is it still, and let's say it's now 60 years old, give or take, it's about that old. So given the method is 60 years old, is it still one of the best methods for us to be using for doing reserving? And for me, it's an unequivocal yes, it is definitely one of the best methods for us to be using for reserving, and I'm going to tell you why I feel that way in a moment. That doesn't mean that's the only method we should be using, and of course we do use other methods. I probably should have said, I'm kind of talking about chain ladder, but I'm also in a way talking about all methods based on aggregate claim data. There's nothing special about the BF methods and the variants of that. It's, again, a pretty simple method that we're using. So, in a way, the comments, even though I've focused on the chain ladder, pretty well apply to any of the methods we're using where we're basically calculating ratios linking to these aggregate claim triangles. So, is it appropriate that we're still using methods almost exclusively relying on aggregate claim data? Not too sure. I'll come to that. And here's one that's interesting for me. What do you think? Has anyone here tried to take some data scientists through the chain ladder method? And JV, you said you were doing something similar. Has anyone else tried to do that? Yep, one. Do you remember what they thought when they saw it? Are you happy to share very briefly what they thought when you showed it to them? No? That's okay. So I've done that as well. They are massively underwhelmed when they see that this method that we've been using for so long, and that this kind of some apparent complexity around is so simple, and that's the kind of extent of the work we're doing. Now, that doesn't mean it's not right, but it is kind of really interesting to get a different perspective on that. The data scientists are getting very involved in pricing work now. That makes sense to me. What I'd really like to be happening is the data scientists working alongside the actuaries in that work rather than it being one or the other. And I could talk about that for a long time, but I think it's best done using both. Reserving, could the same thing happen? I think so, unless we get our skates on and start doing stuff. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is talk about why it's lasted so long, like why we like it so much. So why do actuaries love the chain ladder? I'm going to use an analogy. The chain ladder is a bit like, it's a flying analogy. The chain ladder is like hang gliding. And what I mean by that is we're totally in control, and it's all down to our feel and sense. They talk about hang gliding being the purest form of flying, so with this reserving, there's not many diagnostics we've got. It's a lot of gut feel and sense that we're going to use this kind of more art than science to fly this thing. So that's my analogy. They say that once you've gone hang gliding, you'll never stop. Now, I kind of worry that means once you've used the chain ladder, you'll never stop. That seems to be the path we're on at the moment. So why do we like it? And there are good reasons. I think we're almost certainly going to be using it in 10 years' time, and probably 20 and 30. So there's reasons why we like it. Transparency. I mean, this thing is so far removed from being a black box that kind of makes it easy, especially given reserving, no matter what approach you use, is going to need to involve layers of judgment. And it is very easy to apply judgments to a chain ladder approach. So the actual judgments are easily made, and because the method's so transparent, they're easy to explain to stakeholders. So that's really important to us as well. With the chain ladder method, and in fact with all of these aggregate methods, you can almost get whatever number you want. And in a way that's kind of a shame, but it's also very helpful because you do have robust discussions with the management and the executive about the reserves, and it's important to understand there's not just a single number but a range of plausible numbers that come out. And with the chain ladder, there's the kind of flexibility for the actuary to exercise their judgment in those discussions. And if I compare that to, say, some automated reserving processes that you might adopt, well, you're going to get more bumps coming out of that, and it's going to be harder to apply those actuarial judgments to manage those. So we kind of like that. It suits us. The AVE is a piece of cake with the chain ladder method and the other aggregate claim method, so that stuff's easy. I must admit, I'd love to see more people doing AVEs where they stick confidence intervals around it and kind of see where the results coming out sit within the confidence range. We do know stuff about the variability of the results, and I'd like to see more of that. The fact that it's so widely used means there's benchmarks. That's really important. And again, if I compare that to some automated approaches, we're not going to be able to get access to some of those benefits either. So that works very well. And so benchmarks, and just if you need to get and build up a reserving team. There's, of course, a lot of people that know how to do these techniques, and if they don't, they're not hard to train. So access to resources is really easy as well. The key with this method is it's all about the skill of the actuary. And JV, again, you again alluded to this, and your colleague who'd spend days looking at the triangles. When I first started doing reserving work in the, 84, 85, I had a whole bunch of coloured pens, and I'd be going down through triangles, kind of circling all the lowest numbers and circling all the highest numbers in particular colours, and then using that to help me kind of detect shapes and trends and that kind of stuff. Because what the actuary needs to do is understand what's going on that's causing the results to be like it is in that triangle. And we finish up with an understanding that looks something like this. That same triangle, we get a sense of, well, there was a trend in the first development year in terms of the ratios are higher now than they used to be. There's a few diagonal effects we'll need to understand. And as JV said, we'll then go and have a chat to the claims team, and we'll chat to the underwriters, and we'll find out what could have caused some of those. And it's not until we've done all that we can actually reliably use the method to come up with estimates. So there's a lot of art over science in this approach of trying to understand what's in the data. There are certain ways that you can kind of use automated diagnostics to help you understand some of these things now. That's perhaps wasn't available before, but essentially it's about understanding what's causing that small triangle to look like it does, talking to relevant people, and then you're well placed to make some judgments. Okay, so if what I've kind of outlined is the chain ladder's been with us for a long time, something like 60 odd years. It is a great, it and the other aggregate claim data-based methods have survived well because they provide us with that transparency and the ability to apply judgments in an easy way. Our kids, or the chain ladder's kids, they made some developments. It's not fair to say nothing's happened in the last 50 years. So they have made some improvements since the 72 or 62. Yeah, so in the last 60 years, they've made some improvements, mostly around, understanding the variability and which drives the selection of the factors that are applied in the model, that kind of stuff. So it's almost tinkering with the same approach, but that's where most of the advances have been. And look, they've been some good advances, but essentially we're looking at how do we weight the BF type approaches with chain ladder type approaches, and how do we pick the factors for those models, and how do we pick our loss ratios to use. So all pretty simple stuff, really, in terms of developments. I think that there's an expression going around that's something like what we have, nothing can happen for decades, and then a decade can happen in a week. And I feel with reserving, we're going to have something like that. Not that much has happened for 60 years, maybe for 100 years, because the two Rons were lamenting that nothing had happened in the 40 years before their stuff came out. So not much has happened for a long time, but I think we're now getting to a phase where we're going to see a bit more going on. And you all know what that's all about. So I'm going to then talk to ML approaches, essentially AI approaches, and what's been holding us back and how might they emerge in practice. And I'll touch on, to the extent I'm able to, some of the work that I'm being involved with at Chubb, where we're applying some of these approaches to at least part of the reserving question, not the full thing. But again, I've got to be careful how much I say there. Okay, why haven't we been a bit faster? Because it's kind of obvious, isn't it, that the method's so old, and we've got a lot of data sitting in the individual claim records that we could be using to build better models of what the ultimate cost looks like. I mean, I think we can all see that. It's pretty obvious. So why haven't we been doing it? And I think there's a range of reasons. One would be, maybe a bit of apathy. If if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I mean, what we've got's pretty good. So do we really need to be applying something more complicated to get a better answer? Is the answer really better? I think that's not an unfair place to start. I've certainly thought that myself from time to time. We're all so tied up with business as usual work, especially on the reserving side, and you get into your kind of monthly and quarterly reserving cycles, and it's pretty full on. Do we have the time set aside to invest to be able to develop these new processes? Because it is a fair bit of investment that needs to happen, so that's definitely held people back. And I should say, the IFOA have done some really good surveys around this, where they've looked at some of the reasons why it's holding people back. One of the other ones they talk to is expertise. A lot of the people responsible for reserving are a bit like me. They're getting a bit long in the tooth, and they weren't brought up with some of these new techniques, and it's kind of a bit harder to move on. So I think the reserving actuaries are, and maybe this is unfair, but people that finish up in reserving might be at the more conservative end of things. So they're just going to be a bit slower to move. We do need to, if you're going to be serious about doing this, you're going to have to invest a lot of time of your team and yourself in upskilling, and that's challenging for people. I've forgotten my two other methods, two other reasons, which I shouldn't have forgotten because they're not special. Yeah. So one is, I think we're all waiting for the answer. Everyone's been talking about these methods, but what is the method? There's kind of lots of possibilities, and I think if we wait for the answer, we're not going to get it because it's not going to be a single method. So we probably need to be careful with that one, but that's certainly something that's come around. The other one is this whole art versus science, and how can one of these methods possibly do what I do in thinking about why the experience is looking like it is. Now, I will have used pretty well all of those excuses myself for not having done and gone down this path sooner. So I think they're all pretty valid. And we don't know the answers to some of them. And for example, the art versus science one, I think we've got to try some of these methods before we're going to get a sense of, well, how well can it do the art piece? And I suspect the answer is, well, it can't do some of it. And for at least for a time, any movement down this path is going to involve kind of parallel estimates, and with the ML-based approaches really providing input into the other reserving process. But it is going to find out things that we don't know about. And for example, if you you'll understand from it better how different types of claims have got different types of development patterns. If the mix of claims changes in a way that you can't see in the aggregate data, it's going to tell you about that, and you're going to learn stuff sooner. So it is going to help you get better estimates. I've got no doubt with that. So when you hear people talk about using these AI type approaches, they're mostly talking so far about using it to the aggregate data triangles. Now, is there really any point in that? I mean, you can only learn so much from a triangle. How much more is that ML-based approach going to tell you about what's in that triangle than you can get by doing a bit of colouring in and chatting to a few people? So probably not much, in my view, but what you're going to get from that is familiarity with ML-based approaches. You're going to improve your skill set. So you're going to kind of put yourself in a better position to be able to do some more complicated stuff. Plus, you're going to get some kind of automated results. You're going to get efficiencies. So I can see that's a good first step. Let's start applying these approaches to the aggregate claim triangles to start getting some better estimates out. That makes sense to me. But I think the real value we're going to get from this is when we apply it to the individual claim data and when we add significantly to what's in that claim data. So, some of the work I've been working with the data science guys at Chubb is building models of the individual claim sizes, and we're using a lot of natural language processing to pull in and create new data fields. So we're going into the loss assessors reports, for example, and identifying snippets there that we can pull into the claim size model, and other things that other data fields we're creating. And then we're building decision tree-based estimates of the average claim size that have got a whole bunch of inputs, and it's working pretty well. So I think there's a kind of a future in that. Of course, it's only one side because there's the known claims that's kind of giving us the IBNR component, and we've got to build a model of the pure IBNR. But again, we're going to get some pretty good learnings from the first model to help us think about what the IBNR looks like if the mix of claims is changing and that kind of stuff. So it's definitely a learning process for us. So I can see a sensible way forward is to start applying this stuff to your aggregate claim data, start building your skill set. Of course, you're not using it at this stage to replace anything you're doing, is stick it alongside it. If it's coming up with different numbers, trying to work out why that is and what it tells you, and we're building our familiarity with using these methods, and then later on we can start, and maybe concurrently even, you can start building some of these models on your individual claim data, and then over time look to how you can bring that into the valuation, and maybe one day start giving it some weighting in your approach. And the more familiar we get with it, and the more familiar we'll get how we make our judgments, because that's still going to be important to us, and it will still be able to be done, then over time we'll be kind of transitioning to the grandkids. So that's the kind of pathway I see. I know this session, there's nothing new in it. It's a bit of I suppose what I'm doing is a bit of a G up for us to really set aside. We need to set aside time to enable us to do this. We need to invest in the capabilities so that we can do it. It all comes back to needing some curiosity. And I think we've got to give it a go and kind of see where it heads. So that's why I think the IFOA has done a great job with their task force they've set up on this. But I suppose I'm really keen to see more companies moving down this path. I don't know if we'll get that method that we can all then take and drop into our portfolio. There may be a whole bunch of methods. But I do think we've got to start giving it a go and then start working out how we can still keep applying our actuarial overlay, etc., to the results that come out. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Sorry, Frank, I did want to talk to that last slide.
Oh, guess you're not done. All right.
Because I wanted to come back to my analogy. Oh, sorry, is my presentation, can it come back? Sorry. So if I go...
Sorry.
Yep, it's on yours still. I was going to go back to my flying analogy. So maybe it flicked up there briefly. There was a... So if I go back to the flying analogy, the chain ladder was the hang gliding. The ML-based approaches were now in the modern jetliner, which can basically do anything. They can't yet take off, but they can basically do everything else. I was quite... In researching what I'd say about the modern jetliner, I looked up this survey, which was 500 British pilots, and of the 500, 40% admitted to sleeping on the job, because the plane can basically do what they need to. And the thing I found really funny was, of that 40%, 31% said when they woke up, their co-pilot was sleeping as well. So that's obviously saying they've got some confidence in those modern passenger planes to get us through. So that was just the anecdote I wanted to throw onto that. There was nothing else. So sorry for wasting your time, Frank.
That's okay. I don't think you're wasting my time. All right. So let's get the slides up. Actually, I've got an intro before the slides come up. So actuaries are typically known for their work in traditional roles such as insurance companies, pension funds, and consulting firms. However, many actuaries are also taking on non-traditional roles in fields such as healthcare, technology, and government. These roles require actuaries to use their analytical and problem-solving skills to tackle complex challenges outside of the insurance industry and are proving to be an exciting new frontier for the profession. And that was written by ChatGPT.
So today I'm going to tell you some stories, and I think you are probably curious why Google and Uber would need an actuary and why tech companies would even think about actuaries. So I'm going to start with some stories, and then I'm going to do an example at the end, and that example actually has the chain ladder in it. Haha! So we're doing a lot of chain ladder today. I hope you like triangles. So I started my career as a career changer. I was a PhD in math, fresh PhD, couldn't find a job, so I was changing diapers and teaching piano lessons so I could study for actuarial exams. So I thought, actuarial exams require math, I've got a PhD in math, how hard could it be? Turns out they're actually pretty hard, but I managed to get through a few of them and got a job at a few insurance companies. And I'm gonna give you a theme. My first theme tonight, or today, is that you have to be intellectually curious. I was just like many of you wrote actuarial work. So they had work like reading competitor filings to see what factors they're using and transcribing them and typing hundreds of pages of numbers as fast as you can with your fingers. Got really good with the 10 key, just typing factors up. Really boring work and doesn't help you become intellectually curious. But then I figured out, hey, these ratings are online, so why don't I just write a web scraper that hits their quote engine over and over again and pull the quotes down so I can save myself a lot of time. You can call it lazy, you can call it intellectually curious, which is a better way of putting it, but that's what I did when I was at insurance companies, and I learned a lot. I love what you said, JV, about actuaries having access to a lot of data. And when I was at Fireman's Fund, I was curious. What does a policy even look like? Actually, raise your hands. How many of you have actually seen an insurance policy that your company sells, if you are an insurance company? Great. Okay, you're all hired. Come up afterwards. So that's great because you have to be curious about your product. This is your livelihood. Your company sells those things, right? And they make money and they pay you. I used to think, hey, I forgot the expense ratio here. And they're like, that's your pay. If you don't put expense ratio as a provision in there, you don't get paid. So I learned a lot. I got my fellowship with the CAS, passing through all their exams. And then Google came knocking. And because I had read these insurance policies, I was competent about insurance. Google was hiring an actuary, but they were hiring more. They were hiring an insurance professional. You know more insurance than the average person at Google. I guarantee it. And when they hire you, that is your secret sauce. That is why you are valuable. What's interesting about Google is they do all sorts of weird things. So up on the screen, you can barely see it. Those are my kids on a Kobe or a conference bike. So you can actually have meetings on a bike where one person steers and the other 5 people pedal. I guess the leader or facilitator will be the one steering, and everyone will be out of breath. Anyway, it's a fun place to work. I worked on insurance. I'll talk about this a little more. They have a lot of insurance that's retained, so you can imagine there's some basic pricing and reserving, which I'll talk about. But they also had to figure out the risk of a self-driving vehicle, which I got to work on. And it's a very creative place, and you have to be a creative actuary. I was in a room, and they said, hey, we need to figure out what the risk is of our new design for the self-driving car. And some engineer walked in and said, what if we do spherical wheels? In the next 30 minutes, they were arguing about how many ball bearings you need for a spherical wheel, because they're trying to say, if it's a spherical wheel, you can just stop and turn and change direction and avoid accidents. But the amount of ball bearings that you need to do that is difficult. But how would you do something like that? You have to be curious. There actually is a lot of data out there in the United States about injuries. Because when you're at Google, you don't have accident data. There's not self-driving cars all over the place. There's not the IAB or something collecting loss data on self-driving cars, so you have to get creative. Google taught me to be creative, which got me a job at Uber. And Uber has cars everywhere. Google has little things like flying balloons that send you internet. They have street view cars. But Uber has cars everywhere that they operate. And so they have a very large insurance problem, whereas Google is all about ads. So I went to Google, And to just fast forward the rest of it, in 2015, Google expanded internationally, so I had to learn international insurance very quickly. Then they added safety to insurance, so I inherited a data science team. Fast forward to 22, I'm president-elect. I've got about 220 folks between actuaries and data scientists all around the world. I've got teams in Bangalore and Hyderabad, so I come to India quite frequently, but also teams in Amsterdam and other places. Highlight of my career, 2023 GCA in Delhi, right there. You can see, it's on the slide. ChatGPT didn't write that for me. Okay, moving on. So where are actuaries being hired? It turns out actuaries are being hired almost everywhere in tech. All of these companies have a credentialed actuary. A member of the CAS works at all these companies. You think of things like Tesla. Well, of course, Tesla's doing their own insurance. You heard that earlier. But Hotels.com. Well, if all of you use credit cards, you know credit cards give you points, right? They give you lots of points. And if you look at all of the customers of Hotels.com, millions, billions of points, that's a liability. Because those points can be cashed in for free hotel nights or whatever benefits. So there's actually actuaries specializing in reward programs, figuring out what the liability is, figuring out if people are just giving away the farm by saying, here, for 100 points, you get this or you get that. Is that exchange rate correct? There are actuaries working on that. So I won't go into too many of these other examples, but you can imagine that actuaries are well suited. General insurance actuaries, all of us in the property casualty room, are well suited to solve general business problems. You may ask, what are actuaries doing at all these companies? There's actually pricing. So Uber has about $4 billion USD in insurance risk a year. And if all of you like to shop, that's a big price tag. You want to make darn sure that you've negotiated every single penny out of that. No, 3.99999 billion. Right, you even save like 0.5% or even 0.1%. That's a lot of money. And when you're looking at that, you actually want actuaries to help you price your risk. So you have your hedge and understand exactly how much risk you have out there. And then you go to market, and if someone prices it higher, you can say, great, I'll keep some of it in my captive or I'll keep shopping. They price it lower. Actually, in the case where they price it lower, we tell them, hey, you might want to nudge it up a little bit because you don't want to burn the company that writes that much premium. That would be a pretty hard way to go shop for the next insurer. Yeah, that one went bankrupt. Would you like to insure us? So there's a very important pricing problem at Uber. In addition to that, it's the segmentation that you have to understand. Uber is not an insurance company. We're buying insurance. But even as a buyer of insurance, we have to understand our own book. What is riskier? What should we not have? Drivers with low ratings tend to get in more accidents. It's not really that surprising. It's like correlation versus causation. So you can actually do an experiment, take a look at that very carefully, and figure out, should we draw a line so that certain drivers are taken off the platform because they present a very high accident risk, which is dangerous to the rider and also costs insurance money. Reserving, I love that picture because the reserving actuary is always freaking out, right? Like, oh, the dollars are going out and we're burning through IBNR. Is there any reserve left for us? So for a lot of these large corporates, they have captives. And for the captive insurance company that the corporate has, they need to make sure that that captive is solvent. In particular, insurance is not the main function of Uber. It's not the main function of Airbnb. And so you can imagine an insurance company, if you have a bad quarter, you say, yeah, I missed reserves by, 100 million or something. Something where, you might get beat up a little bit, but, you're not going to get fired. They're like, oh yeah, reserves, they're variable. You go to a tech company, no one understands reserves. You heard earlier about the pension being underfunded. I heard a lot of people don't care about the future in some of the addresses earlier, right? Non-insurance people. They don't understand the future. They're like, oh, the pension looks well funded, right? They haven't thought about the future. And so you have a bunch of tech executives saying, why do we have all these reserves? Well, you don't want us to take 100 million out of your P&L, do you? Like, we would have made a profit, except for the $100 million actually happened to lift. If you look at their 10Ks, they kept getting blown up by insurance. Not Uber, because I hired better actuaries. The reserves are very, very important. So we cut it 1,000 ways. We have Tableau dashboards with about 50 pull downs. And so you can look at paid, you can look at incurred, you can look at expense, you can look at every single diagnostic. That triangle that Tim had up with the greens and the reds, we can generate 500 of those at a push of a button and then send them to PwC, who's our auditor. See, we've done our job. And so reserving is a big deal. It's a really big deal, and you have to get it right. And you have to look at every diagnostic because the stakes are much higher. And then you have a bunch of modelers and general claims actuaries, which you might not have at general insurance companies, but it's not too late. You can propose this to your manager or to your chief actuary or to your CFO, because what we have is we have a bunch of claims actuaries. Let me tell you what they do. So say we put $1 billion of premium with Progressive, right? No one wants all $4 billion. So we take $1 billion from Progressive Corporation, a large insurer. We have to tell them, hey, we've done a forecast. You're going to get this many claims a month, and so you're going to need somewhere between 60 and 80 adjusters answering phones. We've squared the triangle, and we've done every incremental diagonal, and we can tell you exactly when and how many claims are going to come in, and we'll send you a forecast every month. You manage to those staffing levels. Very efficient. You don't have people sitting around not answering phones because there's no claims, and you don't have too much that you're burning out all your claims adjusters. So there are operational actuaries in our team that help with the facilitation of these kind of activities. I can go into more modeling, but some sample problems. How much insurance should we buy? Think of all of yourselves as consultants right now. Maybe you've answered this question. A large company comes to you, how much should we buy? How much liability? I had to go to the former CEO of Uber, Travis, also known as TK. Very fiery individual. First meeting I had with him, we had our Casualty tower was expiring, and our insurers were saying, it was Markel and a whole bunch, it doesn't matter. They said, wow, we really undercharged you. We need to jack up your rates. And we were negotiating. They didn't come to a rate that we could agree to, so they gave us an extension. But they gave us a pro rata extension at the existing rate, which is a huge victory, right? Because we know the rate should go up, but they give us like an extension. So we're like, oh, this is great news. Let's go tell the CEO. So we've got the CFO, the chief legal officer, myself, the head of insurance. We're all seated at the table. Travis walks in. I don't understand why insurance is our problem at all. Why do we need it? Why do we even pay a cent for it? If people get in a crash, they should go pay for it themselves. And that was the beginning of the meeting. And we were like, what we thought was like good news was what turned out to be a meeting about why we should even buy insurance in the first place, right? Oh, they shouldn't sue us. We just push it back to the driver. It's the driver that had the accident. We don't do it that way. So we had to convince him. We had to say, you have to buy actually a lot of insurance. So luckily, I had heard about this one claim. There was a trucking claim in the US. So a family of 4. Father gets, driving on vacation, starts getting drowsy. There's a truck, a large truck. Imagine the biggest truck you can think of, parked on the side of the road. The truck driver was sleeping, taking a rest. Father falls asleep at the wheel. Tragic accident happens. Car, careens off of the road, hits the truck, blows up, fire. There's all sorts of things. The father and mother died. The sister survived, but she watched her brother get maimed, and the brother ended up committing suicide a year later. So it was just horrific claims. But the father fell asleep at the wheel, right? So, funny thing in the States, this is why U.S. has billions and billions and billions of dollars of insurance premium. They found the truck driver at fault because the truck driver should not have parked on the side of the road when he was falling asleep. He should have exited or something like that, right? And so the person, even though they fell asleep and crashed and caused that accident, got a $120 million settlement. It's huge, ginormous. So I pointed that to Travis. I said, so there's this thing. Wasn't the truck company's fault, really, but that's what the courts found. And so he said, all right, fine. I guess it is our problem. We should buy some insurance. So sorry, low note there, tragic case. But you have to know insurance, right? You are the insurance professional, and you have to sometimes have these conversations. So that answers how much insurance we should buy. Should we self-insure? Those are other questions that you can talk about, risk tolerance, about thinking of the future, how much volatility the company wants to have. And we'll fast forward real quick because we all like the chain ladder, right? So one of the questions I was asked at Google was, how many Motorola phones are we going to sell? Google had just bought Motorola, their mobile phones division, and Motorola had been losing money. And they'd been forecasting all this stuff, and Google's like, oh, this is bluster, we don't believe it. Why don't we get someone who understands risk? Frank, why don't you have at it? So I went and got the data, and I know can you see the data very well? Okay, good, because I want to ask a few questions about it. So they send me the data, and it's in this format where you can see across the top the month of the sale, and then forecasts for the sale going down. You can see the forecast go after the month as well. So what are some things you notice about this data? Yeah, it goes, there's some weird down-up thing, right? Absolutely. Okay, so I approached the problem. I like that. So I examined data as if it was insurance data. I don't remember if JV, you'd said this, or someone had said, we're careful, we look at the data, so we do that thing. Step 2, we treat the forecast to actual as like a development ratio, right? You can look at things going to ultimate, right? The ultimate is how many you sell. You use something on, you put the CAS exam, but I'm sure the IAI or IFOA has an exam on reserve uncertainty. And then you compare. So, as you observed, it goes up and down. There's some changes even after month end. Look at January. So January is super optimistic. We'll sell 7 million, and then it goes down to 4 million. And then in February, it continues to drift downward. So I said, what the heck is going on with that? If you took data and just immediately threw all your methods at it, please don't do that. This is what I'm talking about with intellectual curiosity. Always check the data. Don't trust it. Don't trust it. So it moves up and down. It's got some weird pattern to it. Seems like March is a little calmer. And then there's severe optimism. And then there's this some questions that I have about the data. It goes down generally, but in March it jumps up, right? What is going on in March? All right, so this is data going into an Oracle software called Demantra. And it turns out, guess what they only care about in Demantra? What period? I think I heard it. They only care about quarterly data. So all of the monthly data, all of January and February is just junk. You just throw random stuff in there, and then if it all adds up, it's fine. And so in March, that's why they're truing up. So I said, okay, great. If I build my triangles, I got to do it quarterly, and then I can do monthly split outs. The other thing is there are returns. I guess I can go back. So you see the downward trend. Those are returned phones. I'll fast forward a bit. So I ask them who the customer is. You do the same thing that you do for a reserve review. You say, who's the customer? How do I understand this? Turns out phones differ. The ones they sell here are different than LATAM, different than US and Canada. And so that helps you with some of the segmentation. It also turns out that flip phones are different from smartphones, are different from other things. So if I just fast forward this to leave time for questions, we did quarterly, I did development, and then I did the bootstrap, and it gave me these fans. So has anyone done reserve uncertainty in the room? Familiar with fans? You take something and go, yeah, I got a hand over there. Great. So I got these fans, and you can see there's optimism in feature phones that kind of washes out when you put everything together, because a fan is definitely lower. And you can actually run simulations based on these LDFs if their residuals are fine, and they were. And I took 1,000 simulations, got a curve, got an outcome, and I had to go and communicate this. There's actually a story here. So the forecast was 3,050 units, or 3 million units. And it was at the 75th percentile. And since we heard all these accountant actuary jokes earlier, I'm going to tell one. So I went to the accountant and I said, hey, your forecast is at the 75th percentile. And I got a blank stare back. I said, you have a 1 in 4 chance of making your forecast. Oh, okay. So another lesson is, not all accountants are bland, but the lesson is you have to learn how to communicate at a tech company too. They don't have a whole lot of actuaries. Anyway, once I got there, they saw that the final outcome was they sold 2.8 million. These are all altered numbers. And that was really close to the average. So at that point, I got more work because they said, wow, that was really good. Here's some more stuff. Can you forecast that? And can you calculate the risk on this and that? And so you just build your shingle, one shingle at a time, you build a store. I'm going to land with this quote here. So intellectually curious actuaries are important. One from the past CS president, Steve Armstrong, one of my idols, he says, I love solving real-world problems using a combination of data analytics, business context, and professionalism. And that's why I walked through that example. It has all of those elements. And what you do has all of those elements. So why can't we apply it elsewhere? Years later, Elon Musk said this quote, I have great respect for actuaries. Come join me. I need revolutionary actuaries. And if you look on LinkedIn, he actually has every actuary he's hired says revolutionary actuary. That's their title on LinkedIn. He hired a whole bunch to do stuff for him. So I'll leave you with this thought. You all have work in insurance. There's ways to make that more creative. There's also ways to use the things that you've learned and apply it to new problems. And I hope that all of you take that extra measure of risk to think about what you can do with the knowledge that you've gained outside of what you're doing. And eventually, that is what lands actuaries in non-insurance roles. Because someday, maybe you'll find a business problem that you can solve that no one else has tried. So I'll leave you with that, and we have some time for Q&A. Thank you.
Since we are not doing Slido, you could just ask your question. Raise your hands.
My question is related to the machine learning. So it's easy to project IB and ER portion of it using the data that we already have. But have you come across any methods or any models that can project IB and YR for which we would not have any claim-specific data because those claims don't exist yet?
Oh, you start. I'm happy to.
All right. Okay. Oh, I get to start. Cool. I'm on mic 3. Okay, perfect. So what's interesting is, so the company Data Robot, which I showed earlier, is focused on IB and ER, and you have a lot of techniques for that. There's actually a paper I would turn you to by Cesar Bologna and Ron Richmond, published in Variants. It is called The Actuary and IBNR, a Machine Learning Framework. And what they do is they take your triangle and split it into tests, out of sample, and you can actually use some techniques. Once you're able to use a machine learning framework, and this will include IBN-ER and IBN-YR, once you have a machine learning framework, then you can boost, you can bag, you can use all the stuff that is available for machine learning to test out. Now, I don't know how successful that is yet because I haven't tried that technique, but that's one paper I would really suggest. The Actuary and IBNR, a machine learning framework.
Is this on? Yeah. I was just going to say, so if we think about the IBNR component, so we've got numbers of claims and their size. And so yes, I think we can definitely learn something about what that cost might look like from this cost that's been emerging in the preceding period, especially in terms of the mix of claims and if we see a shift in the type of claims coming through, the ML-based model is going to be able to start grappling with that and start giving you estimates of the pure IBNR that's reflecting that changing mix. So I've read a couple of papers where people said they've had a go at that. I've not seen anyone kind of publish the full paper and the results, but I think we've got to give it a go, and it's something that can be done. I think we'll get a better estimate of the pure IBNR that way than if we just throw at if we try to estimate the pure IBNR separately by looking at just the number of claims and the average size of a pure IBNR claim. It's going to deal well with the delay to report issues as well as claim type. So yeah, I'll give it a go, and I think that we can learn something. I probably should say not for every class. I think this stuff's going to be problematic for some classes. High excess business, for example, that's going to be pretty well useless. But certainly for many of the classes we look at, I think we can learn something.
Hi, sir. So my question is, what type of actuarial risk exists in the food industry? Like you have mentioned the name of Slice when you talked about the actuaries like who participate in these type of companies. So because I think the type of sale numbers are very constant in the food industry because people get accustomed to the taste and everything. So what type of actuarial risks are you referring there?
So Slice happens to be, I think, a on-demand insurance company in tech. But I can answer the food industry question. I think the food industry has a lot of data that it doesn't collect as much. So if you were asking me, if I were an actuary hired into the food industry, what I would do, I would start collecting data. Like what food is dangerous. I could collect data on other risks like slip and falls and prep time and all sorts of stuff. You can find ways to make that data help your kitchen either be more operable, more efficient, or less risky. So, I mean, it's brick and mortar right now, and there are beginning to be new entrants into the field, like Toast, which is a Boston-based startup, has a lot of point of sale and stuff like that that you could use at a restaurant. Became very popular during the pandemic. But as far as collecting data and being able to optimize things, I think the food industry is ripe for, sorry for the pun, but ripe for improvement there.
But isn't this the work for data scientists or something? Like how the actuarial thing is coming there, I think. That's
a great question. I think what separates, so I have both actuaries and data scientists. And for me, what separates an actuary from a data scientist is actuaries start with business context in their methods, right? They choose explainable methods like the chain ladder. Data scientists start with the method and say, I really want to do some deep learning or some GPT type stuff. We have to meet in the middle. And I think that's what you said in the very beginning of your intro. Data scientists and actuaries have to meet in the middle. So I don't view a problem as being a data scientist only problem. I view problems as being as actuarial as they are data science. Does that answer your question?
So do you think out of insurance industry, does data scientists can replace actuaries there? Like, if that's the case.
I think that's less likely. I've had this debate with a few folks. I feel like actuaries can replace data scientists because we can learn more statistics. We can learn how to code. We can learn machine learning. We can do all that. I mean, I did. I learned Python at 40. So it's never too late. Someone told me someone started the IAI exams at 48. Rushalim said he knows someone who started at 48. So it's never too late to learn. And I feel like actuaries already have the discipline. That's what's different. Data scientists don't have a whole bunch of exams. They have like a boot camp, and 2 years later they're over. For us, according to the skit, it's like pass, fail, pass, fail. It takes a long time to get through the exams. By the time you're done, you know how to learn, right? You're curious. You've got enough that you say, I want to learn more. And with that, you have that advantage. You can learn all the technical skills you need to be a data scientist.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If I might add my 2 bits to it, I think data science actuaries are all just nomenclature. Essentially, the question is, what is expected of you, right? I don't think any company's management says, I want data scientists, or I want actuaries, or I want cooks, or I want cleaners. Basically, they just need a robust answer. Okay, some part of it is bad. I know a lot of insurance companies are hiding data scientists simply because their board have told them, what are you doing on data science? So they go and hire data scientists. Let's leave that aside for the time being. But there is nothing that prevents you from, learning a new skill. And whether that's called data scientist, data science, or whatever it is purely incidental. I think what Frank is really saying is that it's right up your alley. And if you don't, read those papers and upgrade your skills, it's kind of, you know who to blame then, right? So I kind of find this a little, this debate is a little bit of an incendiary debate, if you think about it. A lot of people come and tell actuaries, oh, you guys are relics. You read papers from the 60s. Chain ladder is actually 30s. You basically do nothing. And in the life and pension side, you're doing discounting, you're ultra conservative, you're not, okay, fair, understand the context of the market. But, I have these data science guys who are doing real cool stuff. You don't know how to code on Python. I'm sorry, my dig at my ex-colleagues, you use some proprietary software like Rescue and Emblem that nobody else uses. But, I'm sorry. But, look at these guys. They are, reading from last year's papers and they are fitting XGBoost. Honestly, you speak to a data scientist like Frank, kind of implied, they don't know what they are doing. They are just, scraping codes of, Kaggle and other fancy sites, and they are just running them, right? But we are people who know what we are building a model for. Like someone asked, should I use machine learning for IBNYR? I think the question is asked in the reverse. So I would build a machine learning model for IBNYR for one very simple reason. And if you go back to your company, some of us who work in general insurance space, in the motor third-party line, the challenge that we face is we need to segregate the death and injury claim sizes by region, because each motor accident claim tribunal determines claims differently. And the components of those claims vary depending on the whims and fancies of the High Court and the precedents that they set. Now, again, the point that Tim made, are we, so used to working with aggregates that, we are not doing proper justice? Well, our feel, kind of when we disaggregate data goes away, right? We have to learn. And if in that context we use, let us say, some machine learning technique for a simple reason that it's it can handle more complex interactions. If we use that to understand, using attributes like, the state, the type of vehicle, the kind of person who's had an accident, if you are able to better estimate the severity, we are doing justice to our job. So we should typically ask the question in the reverse. What is it that is asked of me? And what do I need to do? And I think if I might just summarize what both Tim and Frank said, horses for courses. What is the question that's being asked? What do you know that can be used? The prediction on Motorola, honestly, I don't think we appreciate well enough how, Frank has been able to improvise what we already know. I don't know how many people, the thought even crossed our minds that we can take something that we do every day and we can turn it into a problem that's completely, out of the ballpark, right? So it's not about data science, it's not about actuarial science. It's about how you apply what you know to answer a question. That's all I'd say.
I also have one question. So when we say we should start looking for new ways apart from the chain ladder method, is this because we feel the aggregate claim approach is an approximation? And if we go to the machine learning on individual claim data, will that lead to spurious accuracy?
And sorry, I just missed the second part of that question. I got the first part. What's the second part of the question?
Will that lead to spurious accuracy?
Yes, So no, I'm not suggesting we move away from aggregate-based approaches because they're an approximation. I mean, they are an approximation, but it's not because of that, because I think we've got that with any method. I think it's because, to me, this is mostly a question about data. We're ignoring so much data in setting our estimates, and I think there's a lot to be learned from that data, and therefore we can get better estimates. But I'd see that being done alongside traditional approaches for a time, and let's say it comes up with a different number for the last couple of years, it would suggest to us there's something happening we need to find out about, and we then go and find out about that thing. So we'd learn more from that about it, maybe a change in the mix of claims or the reporting delay or something that we haven't noticed in the aggregate data that we'd pick up and then we'd deal with and get a better estimate. So it's not because it's an approximation, because it is. I just think over time, as we get more comfortable with that, we would get better estimates, at least for some classes.
I would say, sorry, I'm going to do some theatrics here. I would say that you should use machine learning to help with other parts of that. So at Uber, for example, I've got my smartphone right here, and this phone has two sensors in it. It has a gyroscope and an accelerometer. So when I drop it like this, accelerometer goes up. When it hits the ground, accelerometer is super negative. That is what we call a hard stop. And if you get a hard stop followed by a long stop, then you kind of know maybe that's an accident, and you can refine that model. And then you can actually know, gee, I think I know where all the crashes are, and you can have an approximation of at least the frequency of crashes before they're even getting reported to you. You can also reach out to those folks that have been in crashes, and we do that to encourage them to report it and also to help them out. So there are ways that you can partner by using machine learning for a piece of that to get more signal.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. It's about creating that data asset. You know, those extra data fields that you're going to get better estimates from, and that's a very good example. Yeah.
Hi. How do you deal with the issue of explainability when it comes to using machine learning techniques in reserving, especially when you're dealing with individual claims data?
Look, I've got no idea. That's where I can see it being done for a time in parallel, and ultimately we'd be explaining the results of the methods the way we normally do, but we may have changed those results because of what we learned from the ML-based approach. And maybe over time we'd find ways of discarding the old and finding ways of being able to explain the ML-based variations. But right now I've got no idea. I agree that's a challenge.
You don't just back into the machine learning. You can tweak all the other factors from your traditional methods to get to the machine learning result if you trust it, right?
Yeah, maybe.
But tongue firmly in cheek. Slightly local context. How many of you can truthfully say you can, explain the loss ratios you're carrying today? Forget ML or no ML. I mean, some of the TP loss ratio defy logic, right? The inflation is going up, rates are going down, but the loss ratios is also falling. So, I mean, forget machine learning. In simple English, if you can explain your TP loss ratios, I'll be much obliged. But as I said, that's just me. So, the last session of the day, I'm grateful to both Tim and Frank for making it very lively. I think all of us will really, concur with me when I say that, it was completely the best session of the day, and I'm honored, to have been a part of this. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you everyone. I think even JV Prasad sir, it was really nice session. I being a life actuary, I think I learned a lot today. Okay, so I would like to request Mr. JV Prasad to present the token of appreciation to our honorable speakers. Now I would like to invite Mr. Karthike Kandoi, Council Member IAI, to present the token of appreciation to our session chair here, Mr. J.V. Prasad. Thank you everyone for coming, and see you all at ACFA at 6:30. Thank you.